Again, welcome to our latest edition of the Generation Podcast. It's good to have you, whether you're listening to us or whether you've got us just on audio. Personally, I prefer audio, but it's great to have you, whoever you are and wherever you come from. My guest today is Fiona. Let me just briefly introduce her, Fiona Christie. And what has kind of led to this podcast is that Fiona has just recently written a book, and this is it, A Strange Unmaking, and the subtitle is 10 Years in Colombia. Fiona will tell us where to get this, but it really is a great read. It's like reading someone's diary and being allowed to do that. It's like a scrapbook of various reflections, memories, poems, insights, pictures. It's not straight prose, it's not straight poetry. It really does have everything. It's an easy read, couple of hours on a Friday night, and you will get through this and you'll enjoy it. Fiona, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. Can you tell the folk just a little bit about yourself? I know that you're a third culture kid, whatever that is, but tell us your story, where you were brought up.
Well, I'm a third culture kid because I grew up in a culture different from my parents. I was born in Peru. My parents were Free Church missionaries there, and I lived there until I was 8, and then came back to the UK. I've trained as a teacher. I taught for a few years. I've taught English in different countries, in Germany and in Moldova, and then back in Edinburgh. And then in 2008, I went to Colombia to teach in the Bible seminary there, which I did for a couple of years. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, you left Peru when you were 8. I have very few memories of up to 8 years of age. What's your experience?
Well, I have lots of very vivid memories. Actually, little scenes, little snapshots. Sometimes I quiz my parents and they don't remember things that are very vivid to me. The landscape, traveling out on these hairpin bends, people, flavors. So much so that 30 years afterwards, I tasted something in Colombia that was the same as a Peruvian taste, and I remembered what it was and remembered the word for it. I think it was a very vivid time. I was, believe it or not, a little blonde, blue-eyed child, and stood out, and so that had brought its own interest and challenges. Yeah.
Were you bilingual then?
I was. I grew up speaking Spanish. I went to a local school briefly, and I spoke just the Spanish that a child in that town spoke. Yeah, I forgot it. There's an interesting thing. I came back when I was nearly 8 and to Scotland with a little English accent because my playmates had been English, some of them, and started school in Edinburgh, ditched my English accent and forgot my Spanish and had to learn it again much later.
Right, was that a relearning process? Did it absolutely go, or were there some latent elements still there?
I think there was something there. I mean, I had to learn the verbs, I had to learn the vocabulary, but I have a quite a nice accent. I have an accent that Colombians would sometimes identify as being from the south of the country, which is odd. And then I went back to Peru and discovered that was how they spoke in Cajamarca, the town I grew up in. So there's something there that stayed. Yeah, I feel for it maybe, and I feel for languages, which I've always had. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, your mum and dad were missionaries first of all in Peru. I mean, obviously when you were growing up, they ended their career in South Africa. Was kind of global mission, the family business? I mean, in the culture you grew up in, was it something that was really a big value?
Yeah, I think so. Things that I took for granted, like missionary books, just always shelffuls of them, children's missionary books, the Jungle Doctor books, and just missionary stories and missionaries to visit. Very vivid memories of missionaries coming to speak at a meeting, perhaps in my dad's church, and getting to know them. So it wasn't, it wasn't a sort of something in the forefront, but it was just very much there. We're interested in the world. We're part of the world. We know that mission's a good thing, and associated with me with stories. Just different, exciting other worlds, I think, as well. Yeah.
Okay, so you've lived in Germany, you've lived in Moldova, Colombia. Are you internationalist?
Yeah, I would think so. I hope so, very much so. I love Scotland. I feel connected here. I love Edinburgh. I love my Highland connections through my mum. But there's something, I always feel this sort of excitement stepping on a plane. If I'll ever do that again. Just that somewhere new, a new place, and just the sort of challenge and excitement of meeting somebody with a different culture and a different language, sort of struggling to make oneself understood. I like all that. I do. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the book itself, and a quick flash of the cover. Tell us a little bit about your story. What made you go to Colombia?
I went to Colombia, first of all, on holiday to visit friends. I'd got to know the Reaños, who many of you will know, Manuel and Patty and the children, when they studied in Edinburgh in the 90s, and stayed in touch with them. And they said for years, "Oh, come to Colombia. It's not as dangerous as you think." And I always just had it there. But it was a series of things. One was seeing a film about South America, The Motorcycle Diaries, which is doesn't actually mention Colombia, but is just the sweep of this beautiful continent. And I suddenly, having not been back since I was a child, felt this pang of, oh yeah, I have to go back. A pastor from Egypt who talked about stepping out in faith to do something you were afraid of, and I realized I was afraid of going to Colombia. So it all came together. I had the money, I had the time. So I went on holiday to visit and had a wonderful, wonderful 3 weeks. But from that came the invitation to go and teach in the seminary. And so that just had its own.
Okay, where was that? In Medellin? What seminary was it?
Yeah. The Bible Seminary in Medellin. At that time, Manuel was the rector of it, and they needed an English program to satisfy the government's requirements for programs, and so that's what I was doing at the time. I was teaching English, so it all came together, and I went in 2008. Yeah.
Okay, talk about Latin America. Can we talk about Latin America as a whole, or is it just, I guess, a little bit like Europe? Each element has got different characteristics.
I think it's. I'd be interested to hear what Latin Americans think, but I would say that you probably can talk about Latin America a little bit more broadly than you can about Europe, and it's because of the indigenous experience, the experience of colonization, and then of liberation, and that's every country in Latin America will have had that process in some form. So yeah, Latin America is this mix of cultures, the Spanish, Portuguese cultures, the local indigenous cultures, and the Afro culture then of the people that were brought from Africa as slaves. And that all just mixes in this great cultural melting pot of music and languages and just ways of being. So yeah, an amazing place.
Yeah, okay. Whenever folk think of Colombia, they think of drugs, they think of violence, they think of poverty. You write in the book about internal displacement. Is that a fair analysis of Colombia?
Well, it's not a fair analysis of Colombia. It is what people think of it, but
disabuse them then. Disabuse them.
Okay, yeah, that's really what I often wanted to do in my meetings. I would get people to throw out some words that they associate with Colombia, and they're just what you've said, and they're all true. That's the thing. It's a violent society. It does produce drugs. There have been, these great drug wars and the cartels and everything. That's all part of its history. But there's this other reality, which is of the the culture, the countryside, it's beautiful, it's green, it's lush, it's every kind of flower, every kind of fruit. The people are warm, and they've found this way of living with their reality that's resilient, that's joyful, that sort of sees the day. So it's just so unfair. That was my feeling. It's just so unfair that it's stigmatized by these one or two things, which have a big impact, which are real, but they're not the whole story. There's this other story, which is if you can go there, you realize it's quite a different place. It's beautiful. It's fun. It's dynamic. It's an amazing place.
I mean, you are a gringo, self-evidently. How accepting are Colombians of Europeans, white Europeans?
Well, you say that, but I actually fitted quite well into my city because it's one of the more Spanish cities. And I usually got away with it until I spoke. And then when people were like, aha, you're not from around here, are you? I would say my experience, and I think this is a common experience, in general, Colombians are thrilled to have foreigners. They had such international isolation in the worst of times, in the 80s and 90s, perhaps, where it was really difficult to visit, that if you went, they were just delighted. And I had maybe one or two little experiences where, it's like a bit uncomfortable. But in general, taxi drivers and just people out and about were really delighted and very, very kind and interested in the fact that I was there at all, and proud of their cities and proud of their country, and happy that I was there to see it. Yeah.
Okay, so you were teaching in the seminary. You moved on to another ministry. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I did 2 years in the seminary, got the English program set up, and then went on to work for a project called Vive, which its main aim was to train churches to minister to children, to disciple the children in their communities. So I started there in 2011. It had been going on for a few years before that. And it works with denominations to go to mainly rural areas of the north of Colombia that have been quite affected by violence, where there's a lot of internal displacement, which you mentioned. This process where people have been pushed off their farms, perhaps to live in towns and villages, where there's a lot of poverty. And the church is there. The church has already been planted. It's been there for 30, 40 years. And we came alongside them to help them run programs for children. And I was involved in the curriculum. So one of the things we did was to produce a Bible curriculum for the clubs that is now being sold to schools and more widely. And I was involved in the development of that.
Yes, so you're based in Medellin, is that correct? You were writing curriculum, but from time to time you went out to the villages to kind of help them deliver it, or why would you go out there?
We went to train. That was really why we would go. So based in the city and traveling out to run camps for the leaders, training events, training in prevention of abuse, training in writing curricula. So visits to the coast, maybe 10 times a year, to do various things.
Yeah. A big thing in mission just now is indigenization. It's a huge value. How did you kind of work that out in a sense that, to what extent were you helping, and was there ever a point when you said, I've got to pull away from here, I've got to let the Colombians do their thing?
Yeah, I think our little project, which is a tiny little story, is quite a good example of that, because it was founded by an English missionary, a Latin link missionary, who was sent actually to teach in the seminary initially, but saw the need, had the vision, and he set it up. He identified a very young student. I mean, he must have been 16 or 17 at the time, called Leo Ramirez, who was studying at the seminary, had a call to the Ministry of Children, and worked with him, mentored him. And then one or two of us came along with particular skills. So I knew a little bit about design of curriculum, had the Spanish, and I got it started. And there was a key moment where a local person was identified who was much better than me. She was a graduate of the seminary. She was Colombian. She could write beautiful Spanish. She had children, and my role went to her. I mean, it was very painful for me. I mean, I'll say it, because that was like my baby. But it was the moment. It was a natural transition, and then I worked for Leo, so he was my boss. I mean, he laughed when I did this, but I asked him permission for to have my holidays and that sort of thing. And he's now the executive director. I still have a tiny role there on a sort of oversight committee that meets once a year, but it's running, being done by local people, because they're so much more in touch with the culture. But I think that moment at the beginning where we were a team, and sometimes we did short-term things with teams of Swiss and North Americans and English and Scots and Colombians all together, there was something very special about that as well. And there was a sort of richness, and there was an exchange of ideas, and a sort of a growth together that was worthwhile as well. And the role I have now is to, I speak up for Vive when I can. I still amazingly still get opportunities to speak to meetings. My church has got completely behind it. So now I'm this sort of ambassador for Vive in Scotland, and that's the role I see myself having. But yeah, I think this idea that you in fact, Latin Link was very good and strong on this, is you're looking for local people, who's got the gifts, who's got the calling, what can you invest there, and then move on. And it might be move on to something else locally, or it might be, in my case, that's it. You've done your 10 years, it's time to go back to Scotland. So yeah, I think that's definitely the model. Yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about church in Colombia. I mean, my experience again of Latin American Christianity is that in worship there's a vibrancy, that really does rock a lot more. Now, your background was, Presbyterian, your church exposure also was kind of low church Episcopalian. That's your kind of two main church influences. So to come from these two fairly sedate environments into, Latin American Christianity, was that a culture shock for you?
Well, I hadn't gone straight there, of course. So I had experiences of other kinds of worship and other church traditions. In Moldova, the team really was from a charismatic background, and so it wasn't a culture shock, but I did struggle to find my place. I will say that, and it's perhaps not surprising, but the first place I found a little home was a Lutheran church, a very atypical, very liturgical, very quiet, peaceful church that met in the seminary that I went along to. Then I realized I needed to get out. I was just a little bit enclosed in the seminary because I lived there, my friends were there, I worked there, and I started looking for churches, and I ended up in a Presbyterian church. However, it's not necessarily a Presbyterian church, in some of its aspects, in the way we might recognize it. And so, yeah, sometimes I found the worship loud and long, and I struggled with that. Yeah, definitely. But they were what I liked about them and what was unusual was that they were very old. In fact, it was the Protestant church in Medellin from the 19th century, unusually old. And they had a very strong sense of where they came from and their connection to global Presbyterianism and the Reformation and things that are unusual. If you think just how much growth there's been in Latin America in the church, many churches are a year old or 10 years or 20 years old. So to have, and that's amazing. It's vibrant. There's the expectation that people are going to come to faith every Sunday. You can open a a little garage, put 20 chairs out and have your church. It's a way of thinking about church that is quite different perhaps from most of our experiences. But I actually found a home and a really loving place. And what I discovered after I had settled there was that they were all from the coast. They were all displaced. Many of them were people that had been displaced by violence on the coast and had come to the city and settled in the Presbyterian Church because that was their church background. Very like Highlanders who ended up in Gaelic-speaking churches in the lowlands. Very interesting parallel there. And so I actually traveled with my work to some of the towns and villages they were from, and they loved that. They loved that sense of connection with my work. So that's where I ended up. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about terminology. In the Colombian or broader Latin American context, the word evangelical often has political overtones. Folk associate it with the kind of prosperity gospel. It's sometimes a negative word. How did you find that? Would you be happier with the term Anglican, Presbyterian, or are you comfortable with the evangelical label?
An interesting thing in Colombia is that you talk about evangelicals as Cristianos, and obviously that we wouldn't perhaps do that in English, Christians, but that was how it was understood. So you would talk about Católicos, the Catholic majority, and Cristianos. Evangelical wasn't associated with politics so strongly because the evangelical church was smaller relative to the population than perhaps other countries like some in Central America and Peru, Chile, maybe. But it's changed. It has changed. That there was a sort of key moment a few years ago where the evangelical church realized it had power. It could get people together en masse to campaign for things, and it has become a much more perhaps politically aware movement, I would say. It has some very negative connotations, unfortunately. I wouldn't use Presbyterian or Anglican or anything like that because they were just so poorly understood and so little known. I might emphasize that was a follower of Jesus. I might, try and bring. Yeah, I would be a little bit cautious about labels just because you might get a reaction. Somebody might say, "Oh, aren't the evangelicals the ones that are doing X, Y, or Z?" And you'd have to then sort of talk about the Bible and get back to some core things. So yeah, it's tricky. It is tricky.
Yeah. Let's unpack the title of your book, A Strange Unmaking. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that came from something I wrote a few months after I went to Colombia. So I went. I was in my late 30s. I gave up a job at Edinburgh University. I had quite a good sense of myself, if I'm honest. I thought, I kind of knew what I was going to do. And I thought, I had a, good church background. I don't know what I was trusting in really, but I went and immediately struggled emotionally. I just felt I just couldn't find my way. I just didn't know how to make friends. I was hearing, because I spoke Spanish from the beginning, I was able to have conversations with people who were telling me the most awful stories about violence that their family members had suffered or something. And I just was overwhelmed, and I couldn't make sense of it at all. And so I wrote this little reflection called A Strange Unmaking because I felt I was falling apart. I felt like I just had no center. I was just floundering. I felt like, I think I write something about the ocean waves, flattening me. And so that idea, and then the idea of being put back together, which God really did in an amazing way through a wonderful former missionary who came and just helped me understand a lot of the things that had happened. That really sums up my experience of Colombia. I struggled, I suffered. Some of it was what is called vicarious trauma, where you take on people's trauma, and everything. I questioned everything. I questioned why I was there. I questioned my faith. I was really, I struggled, and yet that was what God used to bring me back together. So, and to eventually, I was able to go back for longer and have the time I had there. So I had a blog. A lot of the pieces in the book started life as blog articles, blog pieces, and I thought, what am I going to call it? And I called it A Strange Unmaking. And I had the sort of visual of it was a mosaic. Around the corner from the seminary, somebody had bashed up some crockery and made a little mosaic. And that was the sort of image, because that was, God had made something out of the pieces, was the idea. So that's where the title comes from. And I love the cover. I was looking for something particular. And so here's the zebra that started life, presumably black and white, and then had this incredible makeover, and is now all these beautiful vivid colors. So when I saw this, I thought, yeah, this is the image I want for my book, because that's really, the experience I had of being a sort of painful transformation, painful and surprising transformation, I would say.
Loving the product placement there, the blatant pushing of your book. It could be
please
one show or something.
You'd make me happy.
So there you are, you're a young professional working in Edinburgh. It just doesn't make sense to give all that up. But yet, it's not all about sense, is it, Fiona? Well,
that's right. I mean, it's my whole life has been like that. It didn't make none of it has made any sense until I look back at it, and then I can see each bit kind of fitted, prepared me in some way for the next bit. And so the job I had at Edinburgh University, I learned that was my first probably big experience of cross-cultural work, because I worked with teachers from Egypt. So that, nothing to do with Latin America, but it was that whole cultural engagement that I enjoyed so much. It made no sense professionally. It just cut, there was just no way back to academia after walking away from the job that I had. It was maybe a little bit reckless. I don't know. I didn't at the time. I didn't know it was how long term it was going to be. My first commitment was for 2 years, and it wasn't necessarily going to be longer at that stage. So maybe I did. I hadn't quite burnt my bridges. And then of course, the 10 years go by, and you have to think, well, what's next? God has something already set up for the next step. So it's actually not as risky as it sounds.
Yeah. I find identity an extremely interesting subject, and where we get our identity from. I mean, a lot of the folk here, Generation Podcast, are produced by the Free Church of Scotland. It's a fairly small denomination. Everybody knows your father. I'm even old enough to have known your grandfather, your family in Plockton. We're just such a small tribe. How important for you was it to just, number one, I guess, appreciate, that heritage and all these things, but also in terms of your travels and your life experience, to step outside that and look in?
I appreciate hugely my background and the support that I got from the Free Church, even once I'd left. But I also have appreciated the meeting with people who love Jesus, but who see many things quite differently, or have different views of the world, different practices. And then I think what that does is it just makes you really consider what you actually believe, what is actually what your beliefs, and not just what you've always been taught. So that's very a very good exercise, and one you have to go through, I think, to sort of live in the world, and also to find a way of cooperating with people who you might disagree with on minor things. So I think the looking from the outside in, you appreciate, actually, you think, oh, those things were great, and then you can get some distance and say, well, those things are, you might be critiqued on some level. So you just get this distance, which I think is helpful. Same for culture as well. You go away from Scotland and you realize we do things a certain way, and you critique that. So I think that moving in and out is good, and it's unsettling, and that's where the growth comes, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably the theme that runs through the book. It's unsettling, and that's where the growth comes in. If there was one line that summarised your book, it would be that. I mean, there's so many things in the book. I described it as a little bit of a scrapbook with this and that and the other. Is that a fair description? How would you describe it?
I think so. I think that's good. A kaleidoscope or a mosaic, that image. It's a collection. It's an anthology. I don't know. It's just everything I thought of the lots that I wrote might be worth sharing, collected inside covers with a little bit of a narrative, just to make some sort of sense. If you don't know me at all, it does have a little bit of a beginning and an end, just so you know where you're at. But it's very random. Sometimes it might be a poem, it might be a list of things I did on the coast, or things I saw, or it might be a short story, or just a prayer.
Yeah, what I love, because I'm nosy, and I think you're nosy as well, because that comes across in the book, overhearing conversations in Colombia, and Buchanan Street bus station of all places. So I love these little snippets.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, life is just so rich, and that's actually what's so hard about what we're living through, is that just the natural places where you could have little chats or overhear or see things. We're just so limited now. But Colombia was just so rich for that. And then I got into the way. I was just like, my eyes were open, my ears were open all the time for something fun to share, and that becomes quite a nice way of living. Just that sort of curiosity.
Yes, that's the word that came to me. I think you're naturally curious, because these little phrases that you maybe overhear or you see, you reflect on them and you unpack them. So it's really very worthwhile. Did you enjoy writing it or publishing it?
Well, yeah, I did. It was therapeutic. It was. I started work thinking about it maybe 6 months after I came back from Colombia in 2018. And started looking through the blogs and through my diaries and everything, and I just thought, oh wow. So I might have thought, well, actually, it was quite a tough time. It was a hard time. It was hard. I don't mind saying that. But then I realized it was so rich as well, and that's what it did for me. So for me, it was just like it was very healing. And then actually it was lockdown number one. I just thought, well, now if you don't get your book done in this time, you're never going to do it. And so that prodded me into action. And then, there's something as well about putting it out there. It now exists as an artifact in the world, a bit of my contribution to culture, a bit pretentious maybe, but just something, that's out there. So I now have a distance from it. And that's what I need, because, I've the rest of my life to lead. It can't all be about Colombia. And now I have the pleasure of people saying things like, I like the bit about the eavesdropping, or I love this little prayer, or, and that is just incredibly great. Or somebody saying, this piece really, I'm going through something, and this is what ministered to me. It's like, wow, God's actually using it. And then it becomes a whole other thing, and it's very, very satisfying.
Thanks for giving us time today, Fiona. How can folk get the book?
Well, it's available as an ebook and as a paperback on Amazon. So you just need to go and Google my full name or A Strange Unmaking, and you should find it there. Now, there may be people who are boycotting Amazon, and in that case, they can perhaps try and get in touch with me through Facebook or Twitter. You might find me there, and we might be able to come to some sort of arrangement.
So you're,
on Amazon,
it is possible to get the book. So again, just to remind you, A Strange Unmaking by Fiona Christie. Google it and you will find Fiona. I'm sure she's out there in cyberspace. Thank you, Fiona, so much for joining us today. Thank you also to our viewers and to our listeners. Please speak well of Generation podcast. Tell your friends about it. Enjoy listening to it as you jog, as you walk, as you cycle, as you drive. We are here to serve you, inform you by just talking to folk that you may not normally have heard of, may not perhaps normally have spoken. Fiona, once again, thank you for being one of these people.
Thank you, David.